A cop knocked on my door at 3 a.m. asking, "Where were you when your brother's house caught fire?" The knocking wasn't gentle. 3 sharp bangs that pulled me from sleep so fast my heart was already racing before I'd fully processed what was happening. I stumbled to the door in boxers and a t-shirt, squinting through the peephole at 2 uniformed officers standing under my porch light with expressions that made my stomach drop. The shorter one had his hand resting on his belt near his radio, and the taller one was looking past me into my apartment, like he was cataloging everything visible from the doorway. I opened the door with the chain still on, because something about their body language screamed that this wasn't a wellness check or noise complaint. The shorter officer held up his badge and identified himself as Officer Garrett, then asked the question that would change everything. "Where were you when your brother's house caught fire?" His tone wasn't curious or concerned, it was accusatory, like he already knew the answer and was testing whether I'd lie. I blinked at him, trying to make my brain work at 3 in the morning while processing words that made no sense strung together. "My brother Liam's house caught fire? When? Is he okay? Is his family okay?" The questions tumbled out before I could stop them, genuine panic replacing my initial confusion. Officer Garrett's expression didn't change. He repeated his question, slower this time, emphasizing each word like I was being deliberately difficult. "Where were you when your brother's house caught fire?" I stammered that I'd been here, asleep, that I worked a double shift yesterday and crashed around 10. The other officer, whose name tag read Holbrook, asked if anyone could verify that, and I said no. I lived alone. Garrett asked if I minded if they came inside to talk, and something in his voice made it clear this wasn't really a request. I unhooked the chain and let them in, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the light switch. My apartment was small and messy, with dishes in the sink and clothes draped over the couch, exactly what you'd expect from a 28-year-old working 2 jobs to make rent. Garrett walked through like he was looking for something specific, while Holbrook positioned himself near the door, blocking my exit. I asked again about Liam and his family, my voice getting higher and more desperate with each word. Holbrook finally answered that the fire department got the call around midnight, that everyone made it out, but the house was destroyed, and that arson investigators found evidence of accelerants. The word arson hit me like a physical blow. I sat down hard on my couch, my legs suddenly unable to support my weight. Someone deliberately burned Liam's house? Who would do that? Why? Garrett was watching me closely, studying my reaction with the kind of professional detachment that made me feel like a specimen under a microscope. He asked again where I was between 11 and midnight, and I repeated that I was here sleeping. He asked what I did for work, and I explained that I was a line cook at Marco's downtown and did weekend shifts at a warehouse loading trucks. Garrett asked about my relationship with my brother, and the question felt loaded somehow, like there was a right answer and a wrong answer, and I didn't know which was which. I said we were fine, that we talked every few weeks, that we weren't super close, but there was no bad blood between us. Holbrook asked when I'd last seen Liam, and I had to think hard before remembering it was at our mom's birthday dinner 3 weeks ago. Nothing unusual, just family stuff, everyone getting along fine. Garrett pulled out his phone and showed me a photo that made my blood go cold. It was a screenshot of a text conversation between 2 unsaved numbers, messages planning something that sounded ominous and deliberate. The texts referenced teaching someone a lesson, making them understand there were consequences, ensuring they couldn't ignore the problem anymore. The timestamps showed they'd been sent over the past week, culminating in one from yesterday afternoon that said tonight's the night. Garrett asked if this was my phone number at the top of the screen, and I leaned forward to look at the digits. My stomach lurched when I recognized them as mine. "But I never sent those messages," I said, my voice cracking with fear and confusion. Someone must have spoofed my number or hacked my phone or something. I pulled out my actual phone from the coffee table and opened my messages, scrolling frantically to prove the conversation wasn't there. Garrett took my phone from my hands without asking, examining the screen and swiping through my recent texts. He asked why I deleted the messages if I hadn't sent them, and I insisted I hadn't deleted anything. They were never there to begin with. Holbrook moved closer, his hand now resting on his weapon in a way that felt deliberate and threatening. He said they'd received an anonymous tip an hour ago, claiming I'd been making threats against Liam for weeks, that I blamed him for problems in my life, that I'd specifically threatened to burn his house down if he didn't make things right. The accusation was so absurd I almost laughed, but the seriousness of their expressions killed any humor before it could surface. "I don't know who told you that, but it's completely false," I said, hearing the desperation creeping into my voice. "I have no reason to hurt Liam. We barely even talk beyond family gatherings. What problems would I even blame him for?" Garrett asked about money, whether Liam owed me anything or vice versa. I shook my head, explaining that we weren't involved in each other's finances at all. He asked about property or inheritance, whether there was any dispute over our mom's estate or family assets. I said our mom was still alive and healthy, and even if she wasn't, Liam and I had no reason to fight over anything. My answers seemed to frustrate Garrett, like he'd come here expecting a quick confession and was annoyed by my denial. They asked if I owned any gasoline containers or accelerants, and I said no beyond what was in my car's gas tank. They asked if they could search my apartment, and I hesitated because every crime show I'd ever watched said you should never consent to searches without a warrant. But I also knew that refusing would make me look guilty of something I didn't do. I told them they could look around, but I wanted it on record that I was cooperating fully and had nothing to hide. Garrett nodded, and they began going through my apartment methodically, opening drawers and closets, checking under furniture, examining my trash. Holbrook went into my bedroom while Garrett focused on the kitchen and living area. I sat on the couch trying to calm my racing heart while questions spun through my mind. Who would send those texts from my number? Who called in the anonymous tip? Why was someone trying to frame me for burning down Liam's house? The only explanation was that whoever actually did it was setting me up as the fall guy, but I couldn't imagine who would want to hurt Liam or why they'd choose me as their scapegoat. Garrett pulled a receipt from my trash can, examining it closely before asking about a purchase I'd made at a hardware store 4 days ago. The receipt showed I'd bought duct tape, rope, and a pack of disposable lighters. My mind raced, trying to remember why I'd needed those things, and then it clicked. I'd been helping my coworker Jeremy move furniture into his new apartment, and we'd needed supplies to secure boxes and tie down a mattress in his pickup truck. The lighters were because Jeremy was a smoker and kept losing his, so I'd grabbed a multi-pack on impulse. I explained all this to Garrett, giving him Jeremy's full name and phone number so they could verify my story. But Garrett just photographed the receipt with his phone and added it to what was clearly becoming an evidence file against me. He asked why I'd need rope and tape for moving furniture when most people just used boxes and blankets. I said we'd had an odd-shaped dresser that wouldn't fit normally, that we'd had to partially disassemble it and strap it down. Every answer I gave seemed to make them more suspicious rather than less, like I was digging myself deeper with each attempt to explain. Holbrook emerged from my bedroom holding something I couldn't see clearly. He showed it to Garrett, and they exchanged a look that made my heart stop. Garrett turned to me and asked why I had a burner phone hidden under my mattress. I stood up so fast I nearly fell over, insisting I didn't have a burner phone, that I'd never owned anything except my regular smartphone. Holbrook held up a cheap flip phone, the kind you could buy at any convenience store with cash and no registration required. He said it was wedged between my mattress and box spring, and asked again why I had it if I claimed it wasn't mine. Someone must have planted it there, I said, knowing how crazy that sounded even as the words left my mouth. Garrett asked when the last time I'd changed my sheets was, and I had to admit it had been over a week, maybe 2. He pointed out that meant someone had broken into my apartment, planted a burner phone under my mattress, and left without me noticing. The skepticism in his voice was unmistakable. I insisted that was the only explanation because the phone wasn't mine, but I could see neither of them believed me. They asked if they could take the phone as evidence, and I said yes immediately, eager to prove it had nothing to do with me. Garrett bagged it, while Holbrook made a call from his radio requesting additional units and an arson investigator. That's when I realized this wasn't just preliminary questioning anymore. They actually suspected me of a serious crime, had physical evidence they believed connected me to the fire, and were building a case that could result in my arrest. I asked if I needed a lawyer, and Garrett said that was my right, but if I was innocent, cooperation would help clear things up faster. That logic made sense to my panicked brain at 3 in the morning, even though every instinct told me to stop talking and demand legal representation. They asked me to voluntarily come to the station to give a formal statement, and I agreed because refusing seemed like an admission of guilt I didn't deserve. I threw on jeans and a jacket while they waited, my hands shaking so badly I could barely zip up my hoodie. The drive to the station felt like being transported to my own execution. Riding in the back of a patrol car while lights from passing street lamps created strobing shadows across the officers' faces. The police station was mostly empty at this hour, just a few people scattered through the lobby who looked like they were waiting to post bail or file reports. Garrett led me to an interview room that matched every cop show I'd ever seen. Fluorescent lights, metal table, uncomfortable chairs, mirror that was obviously one-way glass. He told me to wait while they processed some paperwork, and then I was alone with nothing but my spiraling thoughts for company. I pulled out my phone to call someone but realized I had no idea who to reach out to at 3 in the morning. My mom would panic and make everything worse. Liam was presumably dealing with his own trauma from losing his house. My few close friends would think I'd lost my mind if I called them with this story. I opened Google and started searching for criminal defense attorneys in my area, saving several names in my notes app while my hands trembled against the screen. The door opened, and a different officer entered, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a tablet computer. She introduced herself as Detective Carver and asked if I wanted water or coffee before we started. I said water, and she left briefly before returning with a bottle that she set in front of me like we were about to have a civilized conversation. Carver activated a recording device and stated the date, time, and everyone present in the room for the record. Then she asked me to describe my relationship with Liam in detail, starting from childhood. I explained that we were 3 years apart, that he was older and had always been the successful one. Liam went to college on a scholarship, got a good job in finance, married his high school sweetheart Kelsey, bought a house in a nice neighborhood, had 2 kids, Meanwhile, I'd dropped out of community college after a year, bounced between jobs, lived paycheck to paycheck in a crappy apartment. But I wasn't jealous or resentful, I said, because we'd just taken different paths, and that was fine. Carver asked if I'd ever borrowed money from Liam, and I admitted he'd loaned me $3,000 2 years ago when my car broke down and I couldn't afford repairs. I'd paid him back in full over the next 6 months, and he'd never mentioned it again. She asked if there was anything else that might have caused tension between us, and I thought hard before mentioning that Liam had gotten frustrated with me last year when I showed up late to Thanksgiving dinner because I'd picked up an extra shift at work. He'd made a comment about my priorities being messed up, and we'd had a brief argument, but we'd apologized to each other before the night ended, and I thought it was forgotten. Carver pulled up something on her tablet and turned it toward me, showing me screenshots of social media posts I'd apparently made over the past month, except I hadn't made any of them. The posts were on an account that looked exactly like mine, same profile picture and username, but the content was disturbing. One post complained about Liam having everything handed to him while I struggled. Another said people like him needed to learn that actions had consequences. A third, from 2 weeks ago, specifically referenced burning bridges and watching everything someone cared about turn to ash. The posts had my name attached to them, but I'd never written any of those words. I told Carver that someone had either hacked my account or created a fake one, and I could prove it by showing that none of those posts appeared on my actual profile. She took my phone and verified that the posts weren't visible on my end, which she noted in her report. But she also explained that the posts had been seen by dozens of people before being deleted, and screenshots existed as evidence regardless of whether they were still live. Someone was methodically framing me, creating a paper trail that made me look obsessed with my brother and capable of violence. I asked Carver directly who would do this and why. She said that was what they were trying to determine, but right now, all the evidence pointed to me being involved in the arson. The fake texts from my number, the anonymous tip about threats, the suspicious purchases at the hardware store, the burner phone hidden in my apartment, the social media posts. Each piece individually might be explained away, but together they formed a compelling narrative of premeditation and guilt. I insisted again that I was being framed, that someone was going to enormous lengths to make me look guilty of a crime I didn't commit. Carver asked who had access to my apartment, who knew enough about my life to create such a convincing frame job. I said only the building superintendent had a spare key, and maybe a couple of friends who'd visited over the years, but wouldn't remember where I kept spare keys. She asked about enemies or people with grudges against me, and I came up empty. I wasn't important enough to have enemies. I worked 2 low-level jobs, paid my bills, kept to myself. There was no one in my life who would benefit from me going to prison or who hated me enough to orchestrate something this elaborate. Carver let me sit in that room for another hour while she supposedly checked my alibi, though without witnesses or security footage there was no way to prove I'd been home asleep when the fire started. When she returned, her expression had hardened into something that looked like disappointment mixed with determination. She said they'd contacted Jeremy, who confirmed I'd helped him move but couldn't recall me specifically buying supplies at the hardware store, suggesting I might have purchased the items for another purpose and used the move as cover. The burner phone had been activated 3 days ago and contained text messages to a number that had been used to contact someone claiming to have information about Liam's schedule and when his family would be home. The messages were brief and coded, but arson investigators believed they constituted coordination between the arsonist and a possible accomplice. My fingerprints were on the phone, which made sense if it had been under my mattress, but which Carver presented as evidence of my direct involvement. I explained that my fingerprints would naturally transfer if someone planted the phone under my bedding, but she pointed out that required believing an elaborate conspiracy theory rather than the simpler explanation that I was guilty. They kept me in that interview room for 6 hours total, cycling between Carver and other detectives who asked the same questions from different angles, trying to catch me in contradictions or admissions. I stuck to my story because it was the truth, but I could see them losing patience with my denials. Around 9 in the morning, Carver informed me that based on the evidence collected, they were placing me under arrest for arson and attempted murder. The attempted murder charge made me physically sick, because it meant they believed I'd deliberately set the fire knowing Liam's family was inside. I was read my rights and processed through booking, fingerprinted and photographed and stripped of my personal belongings. They put me in a holding cell with 2 other guys who looked like they'd had rough nights of their own. And I sat on the metal bench trying to process that my life had just been destroyed by someone I couldn't identify for reasons I couldn't understand. My arraignment was scheduled for Monday morning, which meant I'd spend the entire weekend in jail unless I could post bail. But my savings account held maybe $800, and I doubted any bail bondsman would take a risk on an arson suspect with no collateral. My one phone call went to my mom, who answered cheerfully until I explained where I was and why. Her voice shifted from happy to confused to angry in the span of 30 seconds. She demanded to know what I'd done, and I insisted I hadn't done anything, that I was being framed. She said Liam had called her from the hospital where they'd taken Kelsey and the kids for smoke inhalation treatment, that he was devastated about losing everything they owned. I asked if he'd mentioned me at all, if he suspected me of anything. Mom said no, Liam had no idea who would target their family like this. That small piece of information gave me hope that at least my brother didn't believe I was guilty, even if the police were convinced. Mom said she'd try to find a lawyer and would be at my arraignment, and I could hear her crying when we hung up. I spent the weekend in that cell trying to piece together who would have access to my phone number, my apartment, my social media accounts, and detailed knowledge of my life. The list of people with that level of information was depressingly short. Immediate family, a few close friends, current and former co-workers, my landlord. None of them had any reason to frame me that I could identify. Monday morning arrived and I was transported to court in handcuffs, shuffled into a courtroom packed with other weekend arrests. My mom sat in the gallery looking exhausted and worried, and next to her was a man in his 50s wearing an expensive suit who turned out to be the lawyer she'd somehow hired. His name was Douglas Finch, and during our brief consultation before the hearing, he explained that the evidence against me was circumstantial but damaging. The prosecution would argue for high bail, given the severity of charges and apparent premeditation. Our best strategy was to emphasize my clean record, stable employment, and community ties, while highlighting the possibility I was being framed. When my case was called, the prosecutor painted me as a dangerous individual who'd methodically planned and executed an attack on his own family out of jealousy and resentment. Finch countered that there was no direct evidence placing me at the scene, that the supposed evidence could easily have been planted or fabricated, and that I deserved the presumption of innocence. The judge set bail at $75,000, an amount that might as well have been $1 million for someone in my financial situation. Mom tried to mortgage her house to pay a bondsman, but the process would take days, so I was transported back to jail to await trial. The next 3 weeks in county lockup were simultaneously the longest and shortest of my life. Long because every day felt like a year of anxiety and helplessness. Short because my trial date approached with terrifying speed, and I still had no idea how to prove my innocence. Finch visited twice a week to update me on the investigation and prepare our defense. He'd hired a private investigator who was trying to trace the burner phone and fake social media accounts back to their source. The investigator had discovered that the posts targeting Liam had been made from IP addresses all over the city, suggesting the person responsible was using VPNs or public Wi-Fi to cover their tracks. The texts from my spoofed number had been sent through an internet service that allowed users to display any caller ID they wanted, a common tool for phone scammers that also made it impossible to trace the actual sender. Everything about the frame job showed sophistication that seemed beyond what a casual enemy would employ, suggesting either professional involvement or someone with significant technical knowledge. Finch said our best hope was that arson investigators would find physical evidence at the fire scene that pointed toward a different perpetrator, something that couldn't be explained by the prosecution's theory of my guilt. During one visit, Finch brought news that made my pulse spike with confused relief. Arson investigators had recovered accelerant residue from multiple points around Liam's house, indicating the fire had been set professionally using techniques that suggested either training or research. They'd also found evidence of forced entry on a basement window that the family hadn't noticed before evacuating, proving someone had broken in rather than using a key or being invited inside. Most importantly, a neighbor's security camera had captured footage of a figure in dark clothing approaching Liam's house around 11:30, moving with purpose toward the side of the building before disappearing from view. The footage was grainy, and the person's face wasn't visible, but their body type and movement patterns didn't match mine. Finch said this could be the breakthrough we needed, physical proof that someone else had been at the scene around the time the fire started. The prosecution would argue I could have hired someone or worked with an accomplice, but it introduced reasonable doubt that I'd acted alone or at all. The private investigator was working to enhance the security footage and identify the figure, though success wasn't guaranteed given the video quality. My trial began on a cold morning in late October, 6 weeks after my arrest. The courtroom was packed with spectators, drawn by the sensational nature of the case. Brother accused of trying to murder his own family out of jealousy and resentment. Liam sat behind the prosecution table looking devastated and betrayed, occasionally glancing at me with an expression I couldn't read. Kelsey was there too, holding their kids close and shooting me looks of pure hatred. My mom sat on my side of the room, and I could see the toll this was taking on her, forced to choose between believing her sons. The prosecution's opening statement painted a picture of me as a failure consumed by envy, someone who'd finally snapped and decided to destroy what I couldn't have. They promised to present overwhelming circumstantial evidence of my guilt. The fake texts, the hardware store purchases, the burner phone, the social media posts, all pieces of a puzzle that fit together to show deliberate planning and execution. Finch's opening emphasized reasonable doubt, the lack of direct evidence, and the very real possibility that someone had gone to great lengths to frame me for reasons we hadn't yet uncovered. The prosecution called witness after witness over the first 3 days of trial. Jeremy from my work testified about helping me move and confirmed I'd bought supplies but couldn't say what I'd used them for after. The hardware store clerk identified me from surveillance footage making the purchase that included lighters. The anonymous tipper turned out to be a woman named Linda, who lived near Liam and claimed she'd overheard me making threats at a family gathering, though I had no memory of ever meeting her, and Finch tore apart her testimony on cross-examination, revealing she couldn't provide specific details about what I'd allegedly said or when. The detective who'd searched my apartment testified about finding the burner phone and described my reactions as suspicious and evasive. A technology expert explained how the text from my number could have been sent and how the fake social media accounts had been created, inadvertently supporting our defense by demonstrating how easy it was to frame someone with basic technical knowledge. On day 4, Liam took the stand, and that's when everything shifted in ways I couldn't have predicted. Liam testified that he and I had always had a good relationship despite our different life paths, that he'd never felt threatened by me or feared I'd harm his family. The prosecution pushed him to remember any incidents of jealousy or resentment, and Liam admitted there'd been moments where I'd seemed frustrated with my circumstances, but he'd never interpreted that as directed toward him personally. Then the prosecution asked about the money I'd borrowed 2 years ago, whether paying it back had caused me financial hardship. Liam said I'd made regular payments without complaint and had even refused his offer to forgive the remaining balance, insisting on repaying every dollar. The prosecution tried to frame this as me feeling indebted and resentful, but Liam pushed back firmly. "My brother isn't capable of this," he said, his voice breaking. "Someone is trying to destroy our family and they're using him to do it." The judge had to call a brief recess while Liam composed himself, and when we returned, the prosecutor looked frustrated that their star witness wasn't cooperating with the narrative they'd built. On cross-examination, Finch asked Liam if he could think of anyone who might want to hurt his family or frame me. Liam hesitated, and I could see him wrestling with something he didn't want to say. Finally, Liam admitted there was someone. 6 months ago, he'd fired his assistant at work, a guy named Owen who'd been stealing from the company and falsifying expense reports. The termination had been ugly, with Owen threatening legal action and making vague statements about Liam regretting his decision. Liam had reported the threats to building security and thought nothing more of it until now. He provided Owen's full name and last known contact information, and I watched the jury's expressions shift slightly as they processed this new information. Finch immediately requested a recess to investigate this lead, and the judge granted 48 hours to determine if Owen was relevant to the defense. The prosecution objected strenuously, arguing this was a last-minute attempt to introduce alternative suspects without evidence, but the judge overruled them and dismissed the jury until Wednesday morning. Finch and the private investigator spent the next 2 days doing a deep dive into Owen's background, and what they found was damning enough to potentially change everything. Owen had a history of retaliatory behavior when he felt wronged, including a previous employer who'd suffered mysterious vandalism after firing him. More importantly, Owen had technical skills from his IT degree and previous work in network security, exactly the kind of expertise needed to spoof phone numbers and create fake social media accounts. The private investigator tracked Owen down to an apartment across town and managed to get surveillance footage from the building's lobby. The footage showed Owen entering and leaving at various times, but one timestamp stood out: footage from the day before the fire showing Owen carrying what appeared to be a laptop bag and a cardboard box. When Finch subpoenaed Owen's apartment with the new evidence, police found a laptop containing browser history for research on arson techniques, VPN services, and phone spoofing applications. They also found a box of disposable lighters that matched the brand I'd allegedly purchased, though these were clearly unused and hidden in Owen's closet rather than deployed at a crime scene. Most damning was a notebook containing handwritten notes about my schedule, my address, details about my apartment building's security, and what looked like a timeline for when to plant evidence and how to execute the frame job. Owen was arrested that same day and brought in for questioning, and under pressure from detectives and the overwhelming evidence against him, he confessed to the entire scheme. He'd been consumed by rage at Liam for destroying his career, and he'd decided the ultimate revenge wasn't just hurting Liam, but making his own brother the instrument of that harm. Owen explained in cold detail how he'd researched my life through social media and public records, how he'd followed me to learn my routines and identify vulnerabilities. He'd spoofed my phone number to send the threatening texts, created fake social media accounts using my information, and purchased the burner phone which he'd planted in my apartment during a time he knew I'd be at work. He'd bribed the building superintendent $200 to let him into my unit under the pretense of being a relative who needed to leave a gift. He'd bought supplies at the same hardware store I'd legitimately visited, wearing a baseball cap and glasses that obscured his face but timing his purchase to create confusion about who'd bought what. The anonymous tip had come from his girlfriend Linda, who'd never actually met me but was willing to lie for him. Owen had watched Liam's house for weeks, learning the family's schedule and planning the fire for maximum damage while ensuring everyone could escape. He'd wanted Liam to lose everything material while suffering the additional trauma of believing his own brother had done it. The confession was recorded and transcribed, and when the trial resumed on Wednesday, the prosecution had no choice but to request a dismissal of all charges against me. The judge granted the dismissal and apologized to me and my family for what we'd been put through. Liam rushed across the courtroom to embrace me, both of us crying while our mom held us from both sides. Kelsey approached more hesitantly, offering a tearful apology for doubting me and thanking me for not giving up even when everyone believed I was guilty. The media coverage shifted overnight from portraying me as a jealous would-be killer to a victim of an elaborate frame job, though the damage to my reputation had already been done in ways that couldn't be fully undone. Owen was charged with arson, attempted murder, conspiracy, and multiple counts of fraud and evidence tampering. His trial resulted in a conviction and a sentence of 25 years in prison, though no amount of time could erase the trauma he'd inflicted on everyone involved. Liam and his family moved into a rental while their insurance settlement processed, and I helped them sort through the few possessions that had survived the fire. We talked honestly about the pain of having our relationship weaponized by someone else, about the guilt I felt for being the unwitting tool in Owen's revenge, even though I'd done nothing wrong. Finch helped me file a civil suit against Owen for damages, though recovering anything financially from someone heading to prison was unlikely. The process mattered more than the outcome, a symbolic reclaiming of my narrative and reputation. My old jobs took me back after the charges were dropped, though I struggled with anxiety and hypervigilance about people following me or entering my apartment. I installed new locks and a security system, and I started therapy to process the trauma of being arrested and jailed for a crime I didn't commit. My relationship with Liam grew stronger through the shared experience of being victimized by Owen's sick plan, and I made more effort to be present in my nephews' lives. 3 years after the fire, I'd rebuilt my life into something stable and good, working as a kitchen manager at a better restaurant and taking online business courses. Liam's family had moved into a new house, and we had dinner together every other week, making up for lost time and reinforcing bonds that had nearly been destroyed. Owen's attack had tried to tear us apart, but instead it forged something stronger from the wreckage he'd created, proving that sometimes the worst betrayals come not from family, but from strangers determined to exploit familial bonds for their own twisted purposes. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.